Hi, everyone. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live. My name is Heather Stevens, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this live hosted by the European Organization Design Forum. So before we get started, I want to let everyone know that the EODF's Winter Masterclass is coming up, and there's still room to register for your seat. You can see the link down at the bottom of the screen. This is taking place from January 6th until February 24th. It's 8 consecutive Tuesdays starting at 4 p.m. European time. The masterclass does contribute towards the Certified Org Design Practitioner certification. So if you're interested, check it out at the link that's pasted below. And we also do regular promotion of the masterclass here on LinkedIn if you want to find out more. So on to today. So our guest today is a consultant, supervisor, and coach specializing in building change capability for individuals, teams, and organizations. He helps leaders develop their practice and impact. He works with consultants and organizational practitioners to develop their change skills. He supports culture change work. He challenges clients to find their edge and stretch beyond better sameness and has been described as the right kind of fly in your ointment. And today he's here to talk about his book, No Silver Bullet, Moving Beyond Quick Fix Solutions in Business and the Psychology of Change Management. I'd like to welcome Steve Hearsum.
Hello, lovely to be with you.
Hi, Steve. Thanks so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. So I read the book last weekend, as I mentioned. I really loved it. I found it to go into so much detail about common patterns that we see and maybe have come to take for granted in business and organizations, both from a level of individual psychology to the sort of institutional underpinnings of why we see these things happen. And you write in a very accessible, sort of informal tone that I think is makes it a pleasure to read.
Good. That was the intent, to make it accessible.
Good. So I want to start out. There's a lot of different things we could cover, but I think I just want to start out by asking, what is the central thesis of the book? What is a silver bullet?
So the central thesis of the book, it has to start with an underlying assumption. The assumption that there is a dominant pattern in organizations that when we're faced with messy, complex problems, in spite of us intellectually and cognitively knowing and rationally knowing that there is no such thing as a quick fix or a silver bullet to a complex problem, that we still reach for them. That even when faced with the logic that it's impossible to have a guaranteed solution, say, to behavioural change, somehow or other we behave as if somebody out there had that. And so the central thesis of the book really is to kind of understand why we behave that way. And the we here is more than just clients. It's not just leaders and organisations who are making decisions to buy solutions. We are all culpable in this. Those of us who provide solutions or answers to clients, whether we are independent consultants practicing org design, org development, whether we're consultants working for big firms, thought leaders, a term I abhor and loathe, gurus, people who peddle methodologies, business schools, so on and so forth. There are many people who have a vested interest in selling solutions and selling certainty. So I guess you could say the central thesis is we have a problem. We are behaving as if there are silver bullets, and we're colluding in that.
So what were you trying to achieve with this book? What kind of motivated you to put this out into the world?
So there's kind of two parts to that question. So achieve and what motivated me. What motivated me was an experience when I was still working at Roffey Park, hosting the Corporate Rebels. And I've talked about this in the book, and I've talked about it in other blogs and posts. I hosted them twice. I was the person who actually ran the events when we had them, and the second time they were there must have been 2015-16, I think. At one point, one of them said to the audience of very experienced consultants and coaches, we started our global tour 2 years ago thinking that we'd find a magic bullet, and we've come to the conclusion there isn't one. And that was no surprise to me. That tell me something that I don't know. But what was striking was that the group, not every individual, but the group, 2 or 3 times after that, kind of went, oh, but go on, there is one, isn't there? And I checked with, I can't remember which one it was, whether it's Pim or Hughes, because I think only one of them was there that day, and a couple of their colleagues, whether they'd spotted this, and they went, yeah. And that's what hooked me. And simultaneously, I'd started, I think, to notice what we were selling at Roffey Park and what my peers were selling. And this kind of dance you get into with clients, you can feel their anxiety. They want you to fix things. And so there was something itching me. So what did I hope to achieve? When I started it, Heather, if in all honesty, I don't know. I think really by the end of it, on the assumption that I was right, and I didn't know before I published it whether I was right, I wanted people to think more deeply. I wanted people to read it and maybe just go, hang on a minute, do we need to scratch beneath the surface here and see what's actually going on? And if I could get people to think more deeply, that was job done.
Yeah. I think so. I've already recommended the book to a number of people that are, I think,
thank you,
in the same. And I got the audiobook and I ordered the print edition as well, because there's things that I know I will want to reference, and I'm not just kind of blowing smoke. I don't.
Thank you.
I am a little bit of a tough crowd, but one of the things that I loved about it was that there is a lot in there about, I recognize these patterns. I share this frustration. I have a friend, one of the friends I recommended the book to, and the thing he likes to say is thinking is a hard sell. And I think for anyone who sort of has an appreciation for complexity in organizations and works in change and is aware of the fact that, you know, even if it's not a simple solution, it's still not going to work the same place twice. Everything is subtly different. Sort of struggles with that kind of, you still need to get hired ultimately. And so you need to somehow sell the sizzle without over trivializing what it is that you're going to do. So that's one of the things that I kind of want to address in our conversation.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you go into quite a lot of detail about is why a silver bullet is so enticing for people, especially people in positions of power, what it is that it's satisfying for them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I'm going to start actually just by picking up something you said, which is your colleague said thinking is a hard sell. And this does relate to my answer to your question, which is certain types of thinking are a hard sell. If you think about what is being offered by, let's take large consultancies, they are selling a lot of thinking. That is what thought leadership is. I would argue that what is a hard sell is deeper thinking and deeper reflection and deeper feeling. Because if you are then into that space, which is the kind of critical reflection, and this is what I bang on a lot about in the book, the reflexivity that you need to develop, that is when you start to wrestle with and engage with what drives the need for certainty and what drives the underconscious processes. So to answer your kind of question there, so what's underpinning this? In no particular order, what we're talking about is things like the ego ideal that we hold in mind as a senior leader. How do I think I need to be? I was working with a group of senior leaders in a global American corporate in the last month, and I asked both groups separately, so who is the kind of leader you aspire to be and why? And it's really interesting what the dominant pattern was, particularly in the first group, which was more senior. What did we get? Lots of men, lots of sports people, and a smattering of military. Now, that is not to be judgmental. It is to just observe who our archetypes are, and therefore we form our ego ideals. Then you come to the organization ideal. What does a particular organization want in its leaders? Who are the people and how do they need to show up if they're really going to progress? So then you're under pressure as a leader to conform to the organization ideal. Then you start to get into things like the need for certainty. You know, we really need to be certain, and that's underpinned by the need for speed because we want everything to happen quickly. There's a need to manage risk because we don't want too much risk. But actually, hang on a minute, risk comes with innovation. We want innovation, but no, we need to manage risk. Then you've got parent-child behavior. So, you know, which we know from a psychological point of view, we know that we carry our family systems and our entanglements into organizational life. I think somebody was saying to me recently that one of the key features of senior leaders is they have a far higher percentage of them come from broken homes than many of their employees. And the other bit that I think I would want to pull out is the simple existential terror of not knowing and not being able to admit to yourself, let alone anyone else, that you do not know and you do not know the answer. And the most beautiful example of that was given to me by a friend and colleague, Eva Applebaum, and I mentioned this in the book, when she was working in the relatively early stage of in the noughties in sort of digitalization and digital. And she said to me once, her biggest challenge with boards was she was working with people who'd signed off millions of pounds of technology that they didn't understand and couldn't admit they didn't understand. And there you have the problem in a nutshell.
So perhaps this is also the case with our audience, but I've seen this tons of times, and I've worked with a lot of executives where when you highlight the parent-child dynamic, this is something that I've seen quite a lot with. I've worked with a number of high-level tech executives, and there is always, we do tend to repeat dynamics, and often those are things that come from childhood, and being often the only woman in those spaces. I have said more times than I can count, like, I'm not your mommy. And there is a big part of it where they get to that position. They don't know what to do necessarily, but the fact that they are in that position must be evidence that they do know what to do. So there's this sort of destabilization of identity maybe that occurs where it's like, well, if I didn't know what to do, why would I be an SVP of this multinational company? I must know what to do. And so I cannot even confront the fact that, I'm not quite following this presentation, or this is a much bigger problem than I have any idea how to confront.
Well, and the bit we haven't touched on is then what this potentially evokes. Because if I can't admit that I don't know, if I can't admit I am not as decisive, as powerful, as authoritative, as confident as my archetypal ego ideal, that then creates the conditions for shame and anxiety. Mm-hmm. And it's these unconscious patterns of shame and anxiety that I suggest in the book drive collusive behaviors between the buyers and sellers of silver bullets. And I've been doing more reflecting and more work around shame and anxiety in organizations and in practice, both leadership and consulting practice, over the last year and a half. And it's really interesting when you scaffold inquiries around shame and anxiety, and you give people permission to be really clear, I'm not doing therapy. So let's just be really clear. But I think we need to find a way to make it okay to talk about how shame in particular manifests in organizations, because it bends people out of shape. So we are dealing with stuff in organizations that is typically very hard to acknowledge and talk about.
Yeah. And results in a lot of, I think one of the things that I wrote down that you said at one point was leadership is a container for projection. That I think comes into play there. So I'm curious to know, for the people watching, to kind of ground this a little bit more, how does this sort of manifest in a more concrete way? Where do silver bullets come into this dynamic? Can you talk us through sort of an example?
There are many examples. I mean, let's just kind of nail up front the kind of the so what question, right? So let's take up front, well, so what? People experience anxiety and shame in life. So why is that a problem in organizations? The 10th chapter in the book consists of a series of case studies that I got from one consultant, and they are remarkable. And the one I'll just briefly reference puts a financial cost to how this pattern impacts organizations. And the cost in that one instance in a major US corporate is $600 million. So regardless of whether or not you agree with the need to go and explore shame and anxiety and functional collusion in organizations, you don't have to do it, but be upfront about the fact that this is a problem. It's costing money. It's damaging organizations, it's wasting time, it's damaging people. And I'd argue it's actually damaging communities and societies. When you look at the relationship, for example, between professional services firms and government, there are problems there. So that one example is is behavior that results in that instance, $600 million being written off rather than any willingness to inquire into why they may have got themselves into that position.
Right.
Which I find remarkable. Other examples of how this manifests. The way in which we see methodologies sold. So take ProSci. I mean, I'm certified in ProSci. I think it's got some good stuff in, and they put a lot of work into it. But the number of times I see and hear of organisations, and it will be senior leaders, bless them, who are often doing this, they will buy ProSci as if in and of itself is the answer. If we implement this methodology, then it will solve the problems. But it is not done with any real understanding that actually ProSci and ADCAR are really just scaffolding conversations. And unless you understand the conversations that need to happen and between whom, and you give sufficient permission and protection for people to do that work, then you're just wasting money. You see it show up in how much leadership development is sold. I mean, the amount of money spent on leadership development, quite frankly, is obscene. And what the research shows, it's for very poor returns. And I say that having done leadership development programs at very nice venues over the years, and I now resist doing that unless it is orientated towards leadership practice. Most leadership development, or much of it, is entirely performative. So we turn up, we do our dance as consultants, and the participants turn up and do their dances as good participants to soak up notions of great and good leadership. So and I'll throw in one more, MBAs. MBAs are a lovely example of a silver bullet for career advancement and for fixing organizations.
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot of things I want to react to. But I think one of the things that really came through in the story you told about the ProSci training and talking with the trainer, and the trainer fully understood that things are more complicated than this, that this is going to require a finesse of human relationships and communication and navigating politics and power brokering and all those things. And those are the things that I also tend to find missing from a lot of conventional change management approaches. But then some of the stories you told from this consultant at the end of the book were really kind of devastating in terms of the amount of care and effort that this person was putting into their work, only for it to be kind of wasted by people who, and this is another point that really hit hard for me, people who do know better. They know that these things are not going to work, and yet they still collude to sell them. And some of this is conscious. I need to make a living. I need to sell the thing that sells. Certainly, as someone who works in change, ProSci certification shows up in a lot of job descriptions. I've kind of resisted that sort of thing because it's a little bit too mechanistic for my taste, but at the same time, that's what hiring managers want to hear. But in that sort of difficult dynamic where people are colluding both consciously and unconsciously to maintain this fantasy, and the way that this takes the form of policing behavior or ostracizing heretics, I want to know a couple of things. One is, can you talk a little bit about this? And then the other is, how does one deal with that situation? How can a person navigate that kind of situation without sort of sacrificing all of their beliefs and values? I know that's quite a big question, but
that's fine. I like big questions. So there's two parts to it: the ostracization and the role of heresy in organizational context, and then how do you then navigate that when you're in the middle of it? So let's kind of look at this from a psychological point of view. When is it that people find themselves being ostracized or being scapegoated? Scapegoating is a psychological process, and the most obvious example in organizations are probably whistleblowers. And you look at the financial crash in the noughties and the subprime mortgage fiasco. There are a number of very well publicized examples of people in those organizations who are going, excuse me, I don't think this adds up. I think we've got a problem. And they were ostracized, and they were speaking heresy, and they either went quiet, were got rid of, or walked. And multiple examples of that. And we see that in also the health sector. I think the health sector is another, unfortunately, very good example of what happens when people speak their truth. And to some extent, we are talking about truth telling. and naming things that are uncomfortable. Because one of the things I talk about in the book, it's an idea along with functional collusion I got from Dr. Graham Curtis and his PhD research. He talks about this idea of thought collectives. And when thought collectives come into being, they come into being because there are dominant thought styles and thought patterns. In simple terms, we all agree that we see the world this way. EODF is a thought collective, and I'll give you a lovely example of how, out the shadow of that, I vividly remember talking to the lovely Nick Richmond a few years ago, and we were talking about, the challenges of blurring the boundaries between org development and org design. When you hear people say, "Oh, I'm an org design purist," or "I'm an org development purist," there you have that's ripe for heresy. What if I'm not purist? And when you have thought collectives, the moment they come into being, so too does what it means to be a heretic. Because what we gather around, we also are creating the conditions for whom and what we will exclude.
Mm-hmm.
So this links, without getting too theoretical, to the whole tempered radicals thing of Morrison and Scully. So how to navigate that? So one of the questions I often ask internal consultants when I'm doing skills development and consulting work with them is I say to them, there's two questions you've got to answer in your work as an internal. One is, how do I progress in this organization? And the other one is, how do I be of most service? And at some point, those two are likely to come into opposition. Mm-hmm. And so the answer to your question is, you can navigate it by becoming more politically savvy and systemically savvy and relationally savvy, but you're going to find it really hard to avoid at some point having to make an ethical and a moral choice, potentially one which requires courage. Because to work around within the dynamics and the patterns of ostracization and heresy means you might need to discover what it's like to be a heretic.
So for me, I am extremely conscious of this kind of pressure because I have had a handful of experiences where, as you rise higher in an organization, it is more acute, the feeling of pressure to conform to a way of viewing the world. You tend to, the way I've described it to people is like, if you pop your head above a certain level of an organization, suddenly people are having conversations about things that are very antisocial, very much treating human beings just as numbers on a piece of paper, and talking about, people's livelihoods and sort of positioning and jockeying with each other for this. And that's always the kind of trade-off that you have to make if you want to be in a leadership position. And I remember being at a company once where it was so obvious that, like, the type of behavior being rewarded was this kind of making a spectacle of oneself, offering a very simple solution to all of the company's problems that was ultimately going to make quite a mess of things. But those were the people who got promoted. Those were the people whose faces appeared in all hands meetings, those kind of things. But then I think there is another element where working in org design and development and working in change, by its very nature, pulls you to the center of the most intense political forces in an organization, because you're talking about power. You're talking about who has who is in which kinds of roles, who has control over which kind of domains. And so there is this sort of, go ahead.
But there's what's interesting is the next book. I've got two other book projects underway for Fool That I Am, but one of them is with Monona Jack, who's based in Switzerland, and that piece of work we're doing, albeit we haven't really started yet, is around what does it take to do change work well. And one of the observations Manola has made to me, which I think is really insightful, and I'm still chewing on the implications, is we all know that organizations and corporates will bring in professional services firms. Let's say they bring in a McKinsey's or PwC, but that conversation is going to happen between executives and partners within a consulting firm. And at some point, McKinsey or PwC consultants will then walk into an organization and meet the internal change team and internal practitioners. And what doesn't happen, as far as I can see, and from talking to Manola and what she observes, there's no framing of what these people have permission and protection to say and do. And the consultants are coming in, and it's not clear sometimes what they have permission to do relative to the internals. And in the shadow is all the power stuff. So I'll give you a really clear example of this. I have a client who works in the health sector in the UK, who was working in a health organisation this year that had brought in 3 professional services firms to review, I think it was their outpatient services. 3 professional services firms simultaneously. And his description of this was they were brought in by an executive and a CEO who were riven by anxiety. And he was asked to be the childminder, the minder of these consultants. But he said he could not question any of it. He knew, he said, that if he was to question why they had 3 consulting firms at the same time, what their brief was, how on earth could they all add value simultaneously, that he would be pulled off that. And there you have your PowerPoint, and there you have a part of the whole change dynamic in organizations that I think we just don't talk about, acknowledge.
You can get in a lot of trouble for pointing out very obvious things. I've certainly had that experience before, and it is that sort of trade-off of, do you want to be here, or do you want to acknowledge what is directly in front of you?
Yeah, which is why I say that question about do I choose to be of service, or do I choose to progress?
Right.
I think is a real one. And the more as a change practitioner, and to be really clear, I'm utterly label agnostic. As far as I'm concerned, org design, org development, digital transformation, HR, all of these are change practices. Yeah. We can get our knickers in a twist about the labeling. But the better you become at these things, then the more anxiety you will face and meet. And so the more you move towards that, the more you will become one of the nodes through which the crazy flows, and the more you will continually be being asked, consciously, unconsciously, whether or not you're prepared to be the heretic.
Right. So one of the things that, as I was reading your book, that I thought of was I read an article in The Atlantic a few months ago, maybe it was almost a year ago, about dissidents. And it framed dissidents in the Soviet Union in particular as more of sort of like a personality type of a person who just, because in an authoritarian regime, everyone is asked to lie constantly, because it's very obvious that there is this official narrative of what is going on, these nationalist myths, and that you are expected, sometimes under threat of death, but at the very least under threat of some kind of ostracization, to adhere to these myths. And that the sort of great dissidents in history are people who, not for a particular political motivation, but they just could not live with that. They just could not sort of reconcile in their own behavior. I will not tolerate, playing along with a lie. I have a almost pathological need to be authentic. And I noticed that in organizations as well, that I've almost put as my LinkedIn header, but that probably doesn't sound very good, of like organizational dissident. Because it very much feels like that is the kind of pressure of like, no, you're standing right in front of me doing this thing, I will call it out, or I will call it what it is, not because I want to take your job or, climb above you, just because I want to live a true existence.
But I think you're really onto something, and I find what you've just said and your choice of word really useful. So this concept of being a dissident, which talks to dissent, what I connect this to is some thinking that comes from a lovely man called Andrew Grenfell, who I met on the master's program I was on faculty on last year and has been working with me recently. And Andrew's thing is that he's researched is power, and power particularly through the lens of masculinity. And he's come up with this lovely idea, which he basically calls a complicity contract. Because I think we're talking, what's underneath what you just said is the extent to which I dissent or I comply. Okay. Mm-hmm. And what he suggests is we give up responsibility and we receive going along with. We give up our freedom in return for comfort and safety. We give up our right to consent for our right to complain, without any real ability to demand change, by the way. We give up our power, our choice, and our agency in return for innocence, just following orders. We give up our right for difference for in-grouping, to belong. And when you look at what we're talking about here in this relationship between change practice or change agency, and through the lens of being a dissident or being complicit and compliant, then we're a short hop and skip and jump from what Andrew would suggest, which is you end up agreeing to be a slave in order to survive.
I think that there is an element of that, these sort of regimes, if we will call them, that just kind of agreeing or going along is not necessarily enough, that you must also be complicit. You must also commit these acts on behalf. You must police others in the organization to adhere.
And we can see this in without getting overly political. We don't need to name it because it's there. We can see this happening in certainly the States, in the public sector there, and other places where you now have to say you will agree, you will comply with this worldview.
Yeah. And the thing that I notice as time goes by and these situations become even more intense is that you are faced with you either have to push against it or you will be complicit in it. And those become kind of the only options, that there is no exempting yourself. Although in an organization, of course, you can refuse to work in the organization.
Yeah.
So I could talk about politics with you all day, but I have a feeling people didn't join for that.
well, in a sense, we're not talking about politics, but I think it's worth just saying, and it's one of the positions I hold particularly strongly at the moment, is it is an utter absurdity to believe that all the anger and strong emotion and position taking and righteousness that we see happening outside of organizations isn't showing up in organizations.
Absolutely.
And we need to find a way to talk about, if not the content, your politics and my politics, we need to be able to talk about the dynamics as you hold your position and I hold my position.
Yes. So this is one of the things that I have thought, working in tech companies for quite a long time, that we've kind of seen come to fruition in the last year or so, that a lot of the behavior of the leadership archetypes in those companies, and you mentioned working with leaders to talk about military leaders as being their sort of idols, is sort of priming people within organizations to participate in authoritarian regimes outside, because there is this sort of imaginary boundary between the organization and public life. But as a person, I'm both an employee and a citizen at the same time. And I think one of the things that you really helped me connect in the discussion of the sort of predatory behavior of the big consulting firms is how interrelated those things are, that it is both preying on the same kind of psychological impulses towards shame and belonging and putting on the air of competence, but then also the direct role in draining public agencies of their money in order to sell something that is, a pipe dream, and undermining the legitimacy of those agencies and public services more broadly towards the public, which also turns them against the idea that government can do good. And so it does indeed, to go back to what you said in the beginning, it does indeed go quite a lot deeper than that. So I want to talk a little bit about I want to get back maybe to kind of the practice of change work And so there's an area, there's a whole section in the book where you kind of deep dive into methodologies and the limitations thereof, and the idea of how theoretical perspectives form and kind of are operationalized. And one of the things that you mentioned in that section is that it's not that theories themselves are useless, it's just that you need to have the ability for discernment, to be able to kind of understand where things are applicable or where things may be helpful, but then understand their limitations. So I want to know if you can talk a little bit about kind of the limitations, risks, but also the benefits of these methodologies that we have floating in the atmosphere.
Well, I mean, in a sense, we're in an adjacent space to the whole raging debate about expertise and evidence. You know, which expert should we believe? And what gets lost in that is that, the scientific method is very straightforward. It basically says this is what we believe until there's such evidence that tells us that we believe something else. Oh, we lost you. Well, I'm going to carry on talking until somebody tells me not to. So the utility of a model or theory is that it is a way of constructing a version of reality. So if I take ProSci or ADCAR, it gives a way of scaffolding and structuring a version of how we might think about change happening in me and my relationship to and with change. If we take an org design model like Galbraith, then it gives us a way of scaffolding the different elements such that we might work with them. But from a psychological point of view, they are also containers for anxiety. The more complex the model and the theory, the more anxiety I would gently suggest that it's likely to contain. It's why I view slide decks and PowerPoint as ultimately being primarily about the containment of anxiety. The more slides they are, the more anxiety that's being contained. And it's interesting what happens when I talk to people about that in organizations. I get so many knowing looks around that. So models and theories useful, but to what extent are we clinging to them? And how comfortable are we letting go of those and just having the conversation that might be being avoided if we were to say, well, we don't have a model or theory? So I'm going to connect this to Brian's comment in the chat, which is this thing about joining the dots. So the problem with some models is that they've joined the dots for us. The question is, have they joined the dots in the right way? And I had an email very recently from a person who'd seen a keynote I did in a global health technology company recently. And he basically said to me, worst effective, I can't unsee what I've now seen. Because he was sitting with his colleagues in an organization that have just brought in consultants, and he's finding himself no longer able just to sit there and take at face value what he's being told. He's noticing how his colleagues, his technical colleagues, are now regarding technical solutions with such certainty that they are going to offer the answer. And he's sitting there going, I don't think that we have that degree of certainty. So these models and theories, these approaches that we adopt, are all fine until they are detached from reality. And there's also something here about the investment we have in them. So when I hear somebody say, I'm an org design purist, I'm an org development purist, my challenge would be, so what are you afraid of? The other bit I feel moved to say is, because I'm really enjoying the 2 or 3 comments that are in the chat there. When I did the launch for the book last year, one of the things I said that surprised people was I said there is nothing novel in the book, except maybe one thing. I think if you read it critically, there's nothing in it that you kind of go, oh, that's really novel. So the functional collusion thing comes from Graham. There's lovely stories from the consultants I interviewed. I've connected other theories and so on. If there is anything novel, it might be I'm the first person to go, excuse me, I think we might be missing something in all these bits that we all know about. And that is why the most common response I get to the book probably is it's a bit of a squirmy read. The number of people who've said they've read it or read parts of it and gone, Oh, God. It's even caused, Heather, the breakup of a business partnership.
Wow.
Very positively, I was told, but it resulted in people going their separate ways.
There was a lot in the book that I was familiar with. There was some that was really connecting some dots for me. There was a moment, now that you mention it, I think you were speaking with a consultant that you know, and she said, "I'm so tired of hearing people say, 'What is the problem we're trying to solve?'" And I am very guilty of that. And I am sort of conscious, but then also there's a little bit of an out of body experience where I will watch myself in meetings adopting the language that I know the audience wants to hear from me, even though I know that it's sort of nonsense.
But you see, where I go with that, Heather, is just that. So I've started to look at doing more keynotes around this stuff, and the whole keynote industry is fascinating. I did a whole workshop, a whole day run by people who two of the main keynote speaker agencies in the UK. And what's clear to me is that industry, and it is an industry. One of the key assumptions that seems to underpin it is that when you do a keynote, you have to sell certainty. You have to sell a kind of answer. Whereas I've gone into the talks I do, and for me, a good outcome is that somebody says they've been left feeling really uncomfortable. And they're thinking more deeply. Because otherwise, we're just colluding that the status quo is actually okay.
Yeah.
And clearly it's not.
Yeah. Well, there is one thing that I kind of contemplated as I was reading the book about. We sort of know, I think there's some data to support the idea that people who are in leadership positions tend to have a little more narcissism than the average population. And part of narcissism is having a bit of a fragile sense of self, kind of an unstable sense of who one is. And that manifests in the narcissism, in the intolerance of ambiguity, in the black and white thinking. And so in principle, they are even more susceptible to this sort of thing because they are less able to self-reflect and less able to accommodate that I'm a good person, but I don't know the answer to this question. So I think, so I dropped off a little bit there. Sorry about that. But I heard most of your answer about theories and methodologies. And I think that one of the things that has helped me in this sort of work is, so I have a background studying political science, and my experience of that education in different atmospheres in the United States and Europe is that you will sometimes get professors who will treat a theory of the social sciences as something they need to prove, something that is fact. It is fact that this is human motivation. We know that these kind of things are not, it's not like the laws of gravity or things like that. And then I had a professor in another graduate program who really took pains to show us that like all theories have value, but they are contingent. They are tools that are used as sort of lenses to view the world, depending on what kind of knowledge you want to reveal, and what you want to understand. And that choosing a sort of fit for purpose theory in that way makes sense, but then also being able to see the edges of it. And I think that seeing the edges of it is something that can be taught, but there certainly is a lot of an overwhelming amount of, I guess, force in the atmosphere to sell these sort of the certainty of this is just do agile, everything will be fixed. And yeah,
it's the pressure to do that is huge. And again, there's multiple stories in the book about this, but I think it's worth just dropping a couple of examples. And one that really sticks in my mind is an old friend of mine, Richard. He's worked in strategy consulting. He's done his MBA at INSEAD. He now does Lego Serious Play brilliantly. And in one of his consulting jobs, he attempted to do something that was in the client's interests, and the detail of it is irrelevant. But with a meeting with one of the senior leaders in the business, the comment that really stuck in my mind that emerged in that conversation was from the senior leader basically saying, just remember whose name it is on your salary check at the end of each month. Because what he was attempting to do was something in service to the client would have meant the organization would make less money, but the client would actually have their needs met. And the number of times that you talk to ex-consultants of large firms and they've left because they can no longer stand being told to sell in more bodies at the expense of building capability.
Yeah. Yeah. You are a consultant though, right? Or maybe you would not label yourself that
Yeah,
way.
absolutely. I've gone through a kind of, what's the word? I've oscillated a bit like one or two other things in my own kind of map of the world through not knowing what the hell it was to being really, when I understood it, really cynical about it. You know, consultants just, you pay them a fortune to tell you the time,
Mhm.
to starting to get more compassionate, to being then cynical again, and then kind of really starting to understand that actually we need to pull things apart here a wee bit. So there's a difference between the individual consultant and consulting practice and consulting the business model. The business model of large consulting firms and professional services is fundamentally morally and ethically flawed, and there needs to be a whole-scale systemic conversation. I mean, an inquiry, a conversation, not a kind of legal inquiry, into how might it be done in a way that is of more service to organisations and to society. I see the consultant role as being a helper.
Mhm.
We're there to help. I'm not saying help in rescue. I mean, well, how can I help? You know? And as to consultants earning a fortune for telling clients how to tell the time, the thing is, some clients have forgotten how to tell the time. That's the point. If I think about take leadership work, I will guarantee you that 90+% of the diagnostics I do with leadership teams, that in the top two things that they say they need help with, it's how do we get better at having difficult conversations and being candid with each other.
Yeah. So how do you help them with that?
You have to help them. It's a combination of understanding self and other and working the muscles to develop their capabilities and capacity to do dialogue and sense making.
Yeah.
Because without that, everything else is just performative bollocks. And that's a technical term, Heather. It is performative
I think.
bollocks. It's, I mean, I'll give you an example from today. I'm in the process of engaging with a new client to do some leadership work. And they have been offered a proposal from a very good looking development company. They've got a very good offer, but it's off the shelf, right? And I'm saying to them, I can't tell you what's going to be in the days that I work with you because I don't know what your reality is yet. And the meeting I had today, I still don't know whether or not come Monday they're going to turn around and say, yes, we want to work with you, or
Mhm.
whether their anxiety is going to lead them to look for something that's a bit more neat and tidy.
Yeah.
I won work with one of the consultancies I worked with, Maven, a couple of years ago, when the client said, we want a couple of page position paper on your approach to leadership development. And I said to my colleague, the lovely Martin Saville, I've got an idea. And he looked at me, knowing that I probably was going to offer him something wacky. He said, yes. What is it? I said, I want us to write a paper on why conventional leadership development is a waste of time and money. And that's what we did. And they gave us the work, but it was a close run thing, because in the system you had that tension between the people who wanted the comfort of managing their anxiety by just going with the obvious, and the people who, and they said this, not me, they said, we recognized that we actually needed to get uncomfortable, that we needed to do the work,
Yeah.
not you.
That is, I think, an amazing outcome that that I would love to see. Um, and I think that the idea of engaging in difficult dialogue. So I work as a consultant as well, and I do notice this sort of people start to tune out when you don't have the answer or you cannot You cannot give the answer in a sufficient amount of sort of clarity. And I've been accused many times of kind of overcomplicating things. But I think, and then as I've gotten older and a little more certain of myself, when potential clients or clients ask me, like, well, you've been here a couple of months, what should our org design be? And I will tell them, not only can I not answer that question, but also you should never hire anyone who acts like they can answer that question without kind of digging into it.
Yeah,
And you
I
do
like that. I
talk
love
in
that.
the book about muddling through, and that the act of this is something I really strongly believe, that the act of navigating friction, navigating resistance really is the work, rather than something that stands in our way. And a lot of conventional change management, and this is one of the issues that I have with ProSci as well, is that it is all about managing resistance in a way that feels manipulative.
Well, yeah, because, and this is one of my favorite hobby horses. I mean, the whole construct of resistance is fundamentally flawed, the way it's typically construed. If I'm really honest, it pisses me off, excuse the language. The number of times that I meet people who've been labeled as resistant, and the only reason they're being labeled as such is because they happen to be asking really good, pointed, uncomfortable questions, and somebody would rather they didn't.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, and so I did a few years ago, I did a change management training, and I started out by asking people, what would you do if you're rolling out an organizational change? What would you do if you wanted it to totally fail? And they come up with kind of obvious things about, like, just announce it and don't tell people why, expect it to happen just because you designed it that way, tell them they have to do it tomorrow, and this whole list of sort of trauma artifacts. And then I ask them, raise your hand if you've experienced something like this. And 100% of the time, they all raise their hands. And we talk about, well, think about a time that you resisted a change in an organization. Was it just because you were afraid of change? Or was it because the change was stupid? The change didn't make any sense. The change, neglected to take into account context. The change created more work. This idea of resistance is really kind of a rational response to the traditional sort of corporate approaches to doing organizational transformation. And so I think, so I'm curious to hear you talk about a little bit how you have that conversation with people, but then also how you go about navigating that friction.
The friction between
the friction of change generally, sort of helping groups of people.
Well, good question. Probably it sounds like an obvious question, but it's a good one that I don't ask myself. I kind of just do it.
I'm the same way.
Kind of says something. Maybe there's a parallel process, is that many of us, if we've been doing this for a while, we don't ask ourselves enough that question just to check. I mean, what I notice the pattern is, and I suppose it is partly what I'm known for in my work and what I'm told I do well, is that I attempt to help clients talk about what really is going on, what really needs to be talked about. It's why I love this phrase, I'm not interested in better sameness, which comes from a great guy called Alistair Wiley up in Scotland. I'm not interested in working with you as a client on creating better sameness. There's plenty of my peers and consultants who will take your money and do that. Go find them. If you're up for the work, then I'm up for it, and let's do it. But this is why also I say to clients, what I aim to do is create useful discomfort in service of learning. And my choice of language is entirely deliberate, because anything that's worth learning in life, I suspect for most of us, has normally been preceded by a bit of a wriggle and wrestle. It's been uncomfortable. Occasional epiphanies, yes, but mostly the really important stuff has probably been a bit. So how is it that we are selling to clients for stuff like change, where there's lots of people involved, the idea that it's going to be smooth? And how is it that if you think about who is selling to whom, that somehow rather we delude and collude with senior leaders and keep them removed from that. I think we do them a disservice. I really do. So one of my observations here, and you asked how I do this, and it's a really difficult thing to do, and I find it very hard to persuade clients to attend to this. If you're going to build change capability amongst a group of internals, for example, then simultaneously you should be doing it at senior level. And that's rare that happens.
Yeah.
Because the most telling phrase from a senior leader in an organization I worked in a few years ago when I was designing a capability building program for consulting skills was, we need these people to operate at several grades above their pay level. So just think about that for a moment. Right? So we want these people to be as skilled and as self-aware and as comfortable with power and politics and change as senior leaders, but to be paid less. And without the power and the authority to take decisions that they might need to, but that we still need them to be as good. So what happens in change is often, I believe, a psychological splitting. Happens particularly with org development. I think less so with org design.
Yeah.
Don't know why I say this, but we psychologically split off all this uncomfortable stuff and we put it into the org development practitioner or the change expert. And then I don't have to deal with that. They have to develop the capabilities. We need change capabilities over there, but not in me.
Well, and assuming that the people at that leadership level do already have that capability as well themselves. Which is fraught, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can be a bit flip, but if we were to come from a compassionate place for a moment, I would argue that everything is set against them, even asking themselves the question as to whether or not they have the capabilities.
Yes.
And everything is set against them, and the conditions are set against them in terms of them being able to admit that they don't know how to have particular types of conversations that you might need to have in a time of change and chaos. So what a remarkable thing it would be is if a CEO or a director of whatever turned around to an organization and said, I don't know how to have the kinds of conversations we need at this time as we restructure. So I need to learn this too. The assumption that senior leaders know this stuff is often fundamentally flawed.
Well, and just saying it, especially as a person who is in a position of leadership, can be so powerful for giving others permission to admit that kind of thing. And I think often in sort of systems thinking, people who are interested in systems thinking and management, we do tend to fall into the trap of thinking or forgetting that the people who are at those very senior levels of leadership are just as, if not more, susceptible to that set of systemic forces than everybody else. And so indeed we can forgive them a bit for it. All right, we are running low on time. We only have a couple minutes left. So
I can keep going. I love this stuff.
I know, me too. I was very excited for this session because there's so many angles that we could take. But you're writing another book. Do you want to talk at all about what?
There's two. There's the first one is with Manolo, which is what does it take to do change work well? And this term change work is not one you can find that much in the literature. It's used on an ad hoc basis. And part of the reason why we're writing it, I wanted to write another book, but not on my own. I didn't want to write it with another straight, white, grumpy man, middle-aged man. So Manola is 15 years younger than me. She's from Transylvania. She's lived in 14 countries, speaks 7 languages. And here comes the real key difference. Although she's been at PwC, she's an internal, and I'm an external. And if you look at the literature on change, the vast majority, if not all of it, has been written from one of two perspectives, either that of the external or that of the internal. There has been no attempt to kind of look at this and kind of go, if we combine these two lenses simultaneously, what do we see? What does it take to do change work well? And that is what we're attempting to do. The other project, which might actually happen sooner because it requires less of me, is an anthology. And I've got somebody I'm talking to at the moment who's going to co-curate it with me. And that is going to be a mixture of either stuff that has already been written. So, for example, Mark Hughes, who wrote one of the seminal papers on why the 70% of all change programs fails stat is a total
Right.
myth.
Yeah.
He wrote one of the key papers, and Mark's in principle agreed to allow me to republish that. There's
Okay.
a great piece of work from the CEO of the Tavistock, Elliot Around, that I'm hoping that she'll allow me to publish in there, and then some others. The key thing is I want them to be perspectives on change in organisations that are not, there may be, some of them may be a bit academic, but they have to have an angle, something
Yeah.
that bites. They may even be humorous.
Okay. This book
So,
was. I think that always helps as
well,
well.
you know, well, yeah. I mean, you do know that the patron saint of silver bullets is Wile E. Coyote, right?
Yeah. Indeed. That makes sense. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. Everybody go get the book. It really is
Thank
worth
you.
it. And I will look out for your future works. I really appreciate you chatting with us.
Thank you for having me, Heather. Been a delight.
Thanks. And have a good day, everybody.
Thanks all.